there was a longing, there was a wanting, there was a sense which I've seen all over the country, felt all over the country, of something lost, of something needing in that word that I'm trying to push, restoration. So what I would say is, and I hope this isn't going to create too much disturbance in the Reform Party, it seems to me that the members are a good deal more impressive than the leadership. For the first time in his life, Nigel will actually have to cope with the hideous reality of power.
Welcome to the Reform Party podcast. I'm joined with my co-host, Wendy Whitaker-Large, but it's a special privilege to be able to welcome Professor David Starkey. David attended the party conference, the Reform Party conference, and when I was there, I asked him if he would consider and give us his reflections. And so that's really the question that I posed to Professor Starkey, is having been at the two fringe meetings you spoke at the Reform Conference, whether it has changed your view of the party and aligned with other current events. Just as a couple of little asides, I got the impression with your interventions at those fringe meetings that your perspective was that the majority of people attending would be former Conservative voters and supporters. And indeed, that was rather borne out by the responses that you got on the people who asked questions. I should say, as far as the Reform Party more generally is concerned, having been myself to many branches, that although they are a significant component, they're by no means the majority, who I would say are people who've been either with no party at all or with other parties, if you brought those together. So if you could couch your comments on the conference, taking into account firstly that the move that those people at the conference represented from Conservative to Reform, and whether they might be beating a path for other people, but also how you think the way it went in your discussions there reflect on those people who came from no party at all, often from that C2DE tranche where Reform is in the lead at the moment, and those that have come from other parties, such as the Labour Party, and even in a few odd cases, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, although they are the odd cases. So could I ask you to just give us your thoughts on your reflections?
Yes, of course you can. Clearly, you've attempted a kind of cephalological analysis of the membership, which of course I could form no impression of at all on the basis of that sort of experience. Let me fill in a little more on my acquaintance with the party, the Reform Party at its various levels. As you probably know, one of the events, because you were there, one of the events that I spoke at the Reform Conference was for the organisation known as PopCon, or Popular Conservatism, the organisation founded by Mark Littlewood, as it were, just before, but in anticipation of the great Conservative defeat of the general election of 2024. And I became involved with Mark literally the day before the PopCon was launched, and I've made, I suppose, I'm now regarded as being the dominant intellectual influence on PopCon. What I've been doing, I've been touring around the country. I call it evangelizing. You had another version of my evangelizing at the Reform Conference, and we've been evangelizing not simply Conservative associations, but Reform ones. So what I can do, I can supplement my reaction to the members, very considerable members. I think it's important to spell out the two meetings that I spoke at. The first, the PopCon meeting, and the second, the meeting organized by the Prosperity Institute, which is developing the legal program that will, I hope, underpin my great idea of a great repeal and restoration. And between them, those two meetings must have had well over 1,000 people present. I think that's a completely fair estimate.
No, I would certainly endorse that, and it was standing room only at your fringe.
Much more than standing room only. The actual seating area, a very significant seating area in that vast void of the NEC, was surrounded by people. Certainly for the second event, when Nigel didn't slightly undercut us by moving forward his speech because of Angela Rayner's fall, people were standing 4 and 5 deep around the edge. It was quite extraordinary. But so I can supplement that, and I can supplement it with my touring around the country and speaking at branches from London to the far north of England. 2 things strike me. First is the point of numbers. The numbers at the Reform Conference are parallel by the numbers in Reform branches. I speak still as a member just of the Conservative Party, and it is perfectly clear that the initiative, in terms of both enthusiasm and numbers and passion and involvement, is now, predictably, on the side of reform. There can be absolutely no doubt about this. There are still very effective and impressive Conservative Party branches. I spoke at one over the weekend at Harrogate, which certainly not quite in numbers, but in terms of passion, in terms of people's dedication, their interest was comparable. But generally speaking, as you would expect, there is a rising tide and there's an ebbing tide. And we know how human beings behave in the face of the rising tide and how they behave in the face of the ebbing tide. Let me give you a little bit of a sense of what I felt about the members. How did I experience the members? Well, I experienced them in 2 ways. I experienced them, obviously, in response, the interventions to the 2 speeches. One, a fairly formal speech, a stand-up speech with a lectern. The other, a dialogue with Mark Littlewood. People were listening carefully. They were following the line of argument and jokes. They were getting the jokes. There was a sense of good humour. Again, part of the face of the party, especially when it's presented by people like Zia Yusuf or occasionally Matt Goodwin, is one of deep hostility to the Conservative Party, the sense of, you let us down, we want revenge, we want to eliminate you. I got no sense of that whatever at the meeting. There was the occasional barbed response to what I said, but and remember, I was speaking on both occasions with continuing members of the Conservative Party for the Prosperity Institute. It was dear Jacob Rees-Mogg, and with PopCon, obviously, it was Mark Littlewood. So we were well received. There was no bitterness, and there was something very different. There was a longing. There was a wanting. There was a sense, which I've seen all over the country, felt all over the country, of something lost, of something needing, in that word that I'm trying to push, restoration. So all of that. But there was also passion. There was serious questioning. People were keen to follow up. They were keen to ask practical questions. Many of them displayed significant political involvement and knowledge. So what I would say is, and I hope this isn't going to create too much disturbance in the Reform Party, it seems to me that the members are a good deal more impressive than the leadership. Am I allowed to say that? Or will this create ructions that will disturb, the existing good humour of my relations with the party? Because what I would say is, whilst really slightly absurd razzmatazz, I mean, whatever one one thinks of Andrea Jenkins' status as a politician. She seems to me neither to have the talents to wear, in vulgar sense of the word, to wear a sparkly blue jumpsuit, and certainly not the talents to sing in public, even when she does, especially when she doesn't know the words. So there was a great deal of nonsense on stage. Remember, one of the words that's been used consistently about reform is that there's a curious camp edge to the whole thing, partly because of the imitation of American politics, where, of course, the razzmatazz and the antics of an American convention have slightly begun to rub off in England. Again, the firework displays and all the rest of it. You can't imagine any other party leader entering onto the platform in that kind of fashion. So there is that performative razzmatazz. I didn't get any sense of that with the members. They really are serious. They want to do things. In fact, watching the razzmatazz, it seems to me, maybe call me old-fashioned. I'm not normally, despite my age, regarded as being terribly old-fashioned. But the razzmatazz seems to me to be thoroughly misconceived. The great doubt about reform is precisely its seriousness, that it's a mushroom creature. It's sprung up overnight. Now, I think, again, I said this very clearly, I think there are fundamental reasons why it sprang up overnight. I mean, I am the first to admit, and indeed the whole of my argument about what has happened in British politics over the course of the last 30 or 40 years is that the popular analysis of there being a uni-party is absolutely correct. We had a series of I call it that slow burn French Revolution inflicted on Britain under Blair, which any proper conservative government would have sought immediately to reverse. And instead, we had David Cameron, followed by Theresa May, followed by Boris Johnson, and with the only break being the very ineffective break of Liz Truss, effectively, not simply effectively, explicitly continuing it, the famous remark of Cameron that he was heir to Blair. And of course, it's that successive process of a profound disillusionment. It took, we need to remind ourselves, 14 years for the country to decide to get rid of the Conservative Party. It's taken them less than 12 months to decide that Labour is just as bad. And obviously, reform is the residuary legatee. It's all that's left. In one sense, you'll remember, I think I may even have made the joke, which is a version of the famous one that Donald Trump himself made, to the effect, if he walked naked in Times Square, shooting people, providing he didn't kill too many Republicans, he'd still be elected. Well, there's a certain truth in the position that Nigel finds himself in, but that might get him elected. It won't enable him to govern. And what I am very profound, and I want to repeat this, what I am profoundly struck by was the seriousness of the membership, the commitment, the energy, the information, the desire to think about politics, to do things about politics, to think creatively about the nature of change, the limits of change, and so on, which was barely on display at all on the platform. I only saw the platform, of course, in recordings. On the other hand, the wonderful development, and I think it is a very splendid development, though it's very much to the detriment of my own party, the fact that a politician as reflective and as intelligent, and one also who has been saying very similar things to what I've been saying, namely Danny Kruger defecting from the Conservative Party and joining Reform and being appointed the head of preparation for government. That suggests, I think, let me be truthful, for the first time, a leadership that's catching up with the membership. that he's beginning to grasp the scale of what has to be done. Because remember, this isn't just a Brexit. And the disaster of Brexit was, of course, that the deed itself was done, but the way it was done was profoundly imperfect. The terrifying inability to follow through the consequences. Again, it is true, isn't it? For the first time in his life, Nigel will actually have to cope with the hideous reality of power if things go as they appear to be going. Up to now, he has simply been astonishingly active. None of us would deny that he is, along with Blair, the most influential politician of the late 20th, early 21st century. But he has never had, he has exercised profound influence, but he has never had that terrible responsibility of trying to carry electoral success into actual administrative and political achievement. That's the supreme test, because what we've seen, Nick, what we've seen, Wendy, is we look now, last year, we had what at the moment looks to be a very similar situation, if we read the opinion polls, that Reform will have. Labour, because of the flukes and the way a first past the post system intended for two parties works when there is a multitude of parties. Labour had that thing called a Loveless landslide. It got just over 30% of the vote, but it got 400 and odd seats in Parliament. Reform is in exactly that same position now. And of course, it's one in which you enjoy, in theory, vast power. But it's only if you, A, have mastered your party, which clearly Starmer hasn't, and B, if you have a clear idea of how to make the governmental machine work, which clearly, again, Starmer hasn't, that you can actually do anything. And the enormous challenge, Nick, the enormous challenge, Wendy, is I think your membership, certainly the kind of members, obviously, the hotter ones, if you like, who turn up at branch meetings, turn up in particular at the conference, is that we have now a governmental system which is actually broken down. When we talk about broken Britain, people are thinking very much of their own experiences, problems on the street, and problems of immigration, problems of crime, and so on. But the fundamental problem, I would argue, the reason that all of these individual problems have cropped up at the same time, is that the little thing, what we call the Constitution, in other words, the beating heart of the state, that itself is on the point of being broken. And therefore, to be successful, a reform government, and I think, again, Danny understands this absolutely, will have to deal with the business of fundamental reform. I want to make it fundamental restoration. But again, this needs to be said, and said very loudly and clearly. Danny will have to receive the complete and full and detailed buy-in from Nigel. Nigel has never hitherto shown any detailed interest in policy. He's not had to. He has been campaigning for big, broad-brush things. Now it's different. Now it's no longer enough to have his extraordinary skills as a communicator, his ability at handling big groups, and his ability at handling small groups, as he shows in his GB News broadcasts and whatever. There will have to be that grasp of policy, the detail of policy, because it's something that cannot be delegated. This is something that's so crucial. So these are the great moments, and I think this is the moment at which we will discover: does this party, with such a serious, passionate, involved membership, have an equally serious, passionate, involved, committed, soaked in what are these terrible issues, leadership?
David, I think that's an excellent summary of your experiences at the conference in terms of your perceptions of membership. And I love the fact that you've mentioned not only a logical and thoughtful approach by the members, but also an emotive, a passionate response. And it seems to me that what you noticed at the conference were the passion, the enthusiasm, the excitement, perhaps slight overexcitement at times.
No. I mean, yes, there was that, but it wasn't just rah, rah, rah. This is precisely the point that I'm trying to get at. It was, I want to know. These are people who are not simply, again, this is not a march. This is not just a protest march. These are people not exactly what they're doing is not shouting in the street. What they're doing is what I regard as the proper thing to do, eager to participate in the political process as it was traditionally understood. But as for so many years, the main political parties steadfastly refused to do, because they had manifestos that were public acts of lying. I mean, let's use proper words. The Labour manifesto at the last election was a variety. It was a mixture of two sorts of lies. It was a few direct lies, but it was enormous numbers of indirect lies. That's to say, the suppression of truth, which is the most dangerous, the claim that you wouldn't need to raise taxation. And it is this dreadful sense that politicians have lied either directly or by implication. Similarly, the 2019 manifesto. Let's tar both parties with the same brush, because they both deserve it. The Conservatives' commitment to reduce immigration, and then the flagrant reversal of that. So all of that has led to a fundamental breakdown of democratic trust, as one of the striking things, I'm sure you're aware, because you too will be a bit of a political junkie, I imagine, that since 1997, the electoral participation has fallen off a cliff. That the number of people bothering to turn out in elections has gone steadily down and down and down. This is profoundly dangerous for any kind of functioning democracy. It's also that the view, and we saw it manifested most terribly during COVID, is that the electorate is fundamentally stupid and needs to be manipulated. Rather than engaging on the old Greek model, or indeed the old model of English politics, that you govern rational men by rational debate. And the feeling that I got, which is why I don't want to push the passion and the emotion too hard, that I got at the conference, these were people who wanted to do that. They listened to myself, they listened to Mark Littlewood, they listened to Jacob, who are explicitly not of their political party. They listened respectfully. They thought, generally speaking, that what we were saying was good, but they didn't just applaud. They questioned, they had reservation. Now, this is exactly how politics is supposed to work. The big challenge now is for your leadership to do that.
Listening to a number of the points you made, I think I would just, on behalf of the leadership, not that I represent them, but I think it's a question of horses for courses, because the role of the conference was partly to attend meetings such as those that you spoke to consider policy, but it was also a rally to encourage those for whom that sort of activity is more to the taste. And given the very wide range of members in Reform, there are different tastes in what people want. And one thing I think no one could deny about Mr. Farage is he has shown great judgment in how to motivate supporters. And I would put the way that the party chose to present itself at the platform very much in that guise. Now, if you take those members, particularly the fringe meetings, they were very much as you would have found at a Conservative Party meeting in the 1990s, 1980s. And they're the ones that have been dismissed by the Conservative Party. When Theresa May talked about the nasty party back in after the 97 election, it was clear from context she was talking about the party members. Whereas, in my view, she got it completely the wrong way round. And that the nasty element in the Conservative Party was the hierarchy and not the ordinary members who, in my experience, showed sound common sense the whole way through. And it never does to diss the members. And I do hope that the party will take on board your strictures and take on board precisely that point that there's a serious job to do and we need to do it seriously. And I think that there is every evidence that they are doing so. At which point, I don't want to take more of your time because you've very generously given it to us. We'd be happy to speak to you all day, and it's been a great privilege listening to you, but I think that would be an indulgence by myself. So
Also, I think we need to resume this conversation in a few months' time.
we'd be very happy to come to this.
Events are moving very quickly. I think that the presence of somebody as substantial, I mean, let me again be blunt, whatever the calibers of other members who have, remember, come and gone, which are the curious in and out of membership of Reform's parliamentary body. Danny Kruger is of a different caliber. He is a genuine intellectual in politics. He is a man who has had experience of important political office, not the very top, but has operated at the center of politics, has thought profoundly, has published widely, has said some remarkable things, I think, particularly on his reflections of the conduct of government during COVID, which are not at all rants. They are a kind of they're not a kind of mea culpa, they are a mea culpa as to what goes wrong when there is government by an unrestrained single issue expert committee, which is one of the central problems of our state, with 444 of these committees, the so-called quangos. So here we have somebody of real political weight. The enormous test for reform, Wendy and Nick, is going to be, will Danny continue to feel at home? Will what he is doing be allowed to grow, to fructify, to shape policy, to be incorporated into the main speeches of the leadership, to become, in fact, the central part of the party's message? At the moment, Reform has ridden on the easy tide of immigration. That, of course it has. And it's a central question. But there is so much more. Immigration, as I keep saying, all these aspects of national decline, these are symptoms, not causes. They are profound symptoms. Behind them is exactly what Danny was talking about in his analysis of COVID. There is a fundamental failure of the state, a fundamental failure, above all, of Parliament, the body that traditionally is what binds us as the citizen, us as the subject to the government, with the government finally answering to us. That fundamental failure of Parliament to perform its proper task, which I would argue, by the way, was the entire purpose of the Blair, I refuse to call them reforms, the Blairite deformations of the Constitution. If Danny can actually carry the party, carry Nigel with him on that, then I think the future really is reforms. If he can't, it isn't.
Well, we'll look forward to rejoining you in a few months' time to see how that has borne itself out. So all that remains is to thank you very much for the time you've given us today, which we greatly appreciate. And I don't know if Wendy wants to make any final points.
I think the challenge is obvious. We need to not just grit the emotion. We need to be intellectually understanding the direction in which we're going, we need to utilize that ability from Danny and enable the membership, and, as David says, the challenges for the leadership to embrace that, to not run back from it, but to grip it and to push it with all their might.
And can I say, speaking still as a Conservative, I very much hope that succeeds.